I'm leveraging the Smart Hotel 360 registration app posted on GitHub. I use this app to guide us through the assess and app rehost migration strategy. You can use this app to try out your own migration. This is an example of an application that's important to business operations, but it's not a core differentiator. Thus, I'll use this strategy to lift and shift it to Azure with the least effort, no code changes, and gain quick ROI. I've loaded this app in my on-prem environment, running on vintage Windows Server 2008 R2 and SQL Server 2008 R2 platforms, all virtualized in VMware. This probably aligns to some of your own on-premises application profiles. Now let's walk you through the assessment with Azure Migrate, rehost the application web servers to Azure IaaS virtual machines, and move the SQL Server database to a fully managed database target of Azure SQL Database Managed Instance. Let's have a look at this app before migration. So let me jump over to my machine, and let's have a look. I'm remoted in to my on-premises environment. This is the Smart Hotel app that I mentioned is loaded on GitHub. So I've loaded that app up, running on-prem, and I can look at various customers who are at the hotel, take actions like check them in, all interacting with those web servers and the database. I can see those running here in VMware. So here's vSphere. I have a list of VMs that are running. And you see things like this SQL, as well as those web front ends, as a few other apps that we've loaded in to this VMware environment. Now to get started, as discussed, we want to go through the assess phase before I start migrating. So I'm going to go back to Azure portal, and I'm going to begin in the Azure Migrate service. I've already favorited that, and it's called Migration Projects here in the left navigation. Everything I do in Azure Migrate is contained in a project, so it helps me manage my migration activities. I've created one called 360 Discovery, and I've already used the Azure Migrate features to collect that data, and those same VMs you saw in VMware are now listed and enumerated here in Azure Migrate. So my list of machines, you can see that list, same names here, and it's not just for Windows servers, it also supports Linux as well. So it's discovered those machines, and now what I want to do is actually map those things up. Well, I want to make sure I'm taking all the components of my application. I'm going to begin by taking that SQL01. I remember that's part of my registration application. I'm going to click View Dependencies for that. What's going to do is take a look at the observed traffic that was observed on the VMware environment and actually map that application together. This is going to help ensure that I don't leave an application server behind. I don't break the application after I move. And so you can see here, here's SQL, and it's actually mapped out that yes, there is a couple front-end web servers, and this is what you do for your own applications. You're going to create a group to represent your application. So I'm going to grab those servers. I'm going to say group those machines. It's going to let me name it. We'll just name it Move It, and so you can see the machines I'm adding. It also has an agent installed, so we can get this network level traffic. So I can pull all that in. It's going to create a group for me. You can see here, that group itself includes a host of things. Once I have my group created, I'm going to create an assessment for it. I've already created an assessment for a very similar group. So if I come back to my overview, you'll see a list of groups I've already previously created. The one I want to go into is called 360 Reg Web Servers, which I've loaded up here. Once I load that group up, you're going to see I have options to create or view assessments. And this is really where I begin right-sizing activity and looking at the cost assignment or cost sizing for my planned migration. So begin in the Azure Readiness. And this is, don't think of it just as readiness, but ultimately, we're going to help you do intelligent right-sizing. So to look at the actual behavior of that VM and recommend what Azure VM class would be appropriate for it. I can drill in and actually edit the properties of this project. So I can control how it actually does the calculation. Things like the target location, maybe where in the world do I want to move this VM, and then how do I want to size it? Do I want to do performance-based, configuration-based, and do how much percentage of utilization do I want to apply once the VM is actually moved? And then for pricing, I can apply discounts I may have, and also apply my Azure Hybrid Benefit, as you noted here. So let's actually close that and look at that cost view. Because what I change there is going to impact my cost view. And again, I want to make sure I know what I'm getting myself into before I start the migration. So a very quick view of what to expect if I follow these recommended actions. And then back in Azure Readiness, the last thing I'm going to highlight for you really sets us up for the next phase. I'm ready to begin migrating my machines. And Azure Migrate's actually giving me a recommendation. For that SQL server, it's telling me to use Azure Database Migration Service. And again, remember, I want to move that to MI, and then Azure Site Recovery for those web app servers, which we just want to move into IaaS. Okay, so now that I have my recommendations, I'm ready to go start moving. So I'm going to go back and look where I want to go. So I'm going to look and manage databases. You'll see here, I don't have any managed databases created to date. So let's actually use the recommendation of Database Migration Service to populate this. So I've already created the DMS service, called it 360DB Migration. And just like Azure Migrate, everything works within a project confine here. So I'm going to actually show you how to begin this. I'm going to create a new migration project. I'm going to just give it a name here. And I'm going to pick that source. My source is SQL Server. And where do I want to go? I'm going to go to SQL Database Manage Instance. I'm going to hit Create on this. And that's going to lead me through a wizard to define that source and target definition. So let's jump ahead to a project I've already created. So we go back here and you see I created Reg App Migration previously. And in this project, once you've created your project, you're going to be able to create a new migration activity. So when I'm actually ready to move it, I'm going to come in and say, great, I want a new activity. And my activity right now is to actually run that migration. And just as you saw before, I'm going to define that source and targeted information. So here I am. I've already entered these details, so we can go through quickly. I've my source on-premises environment, my target here in SQL MI. I'm going to hit save, and it's going to go validate those credentials, make sure that it can actually connect to both the source and the target. The next step is actually me picking the database. Now, in my on-premises environment, I only have one database, so easy selection for us today. And now it's ready to ask me, how do you actually want to move this? And the way DMS is going to move to MI, it's actually going to take a backup and then restore that into SQL MI. So I'm going to give it that source location of the backup, and I'm going to give it a blob storage location where it's going to move that backup and actually process it from there. So DMS, make sure I can now connect to the on-prem backup, extract that out, and it'll, when I kick it off, it'll move it into this blob storage location, and the DMS then does the restore process from here. The last step is simply to name this migration activity. So let's call it move it. I want to tell it how do I want to do validation. In this case, we're just doing a test failover. So let's just say I'll manually validate this and say I'm on my own. Now I'm going to say run the migration. Here we go. It's up and going. I can refresh here in a minute, and it'll show that it's progressing forward. So it's beginning to copy that backup information into that blob storage, and it'll pick it up and process it from there. Now let's let that run, and while that's running, let's turn our attention to moving those virtual machines into IaaS virtual machines, so those web servers. So I'll begin by looking at virtual machines here in the Azure portal. You can see those web app servers aren't there right now. As recommended, I'm going to use ASR, Azure Site Recovery, to actually do the migration. So to use Azure Site Recovery, I created a recovery service vault. So I've done that, and here we go. I called it Corp ASR Vault. And within here, I actually set up replication of those two web app servers previously. So when I see the replicated machines, we'll drill into those. And here they are. And I can say view all, and you'll see those two web app servers that were recommended by Migrate to move with ASR. I can drill in, and this is where I apply the intelligence from Azure Migrate to actually configure the virtual machine as it comes in and lands into Azure IaaS virtual machine. So if I do compute network, you see here, this is where I take the recommendation from Azure Migrate and appropriately assign it to the size or the class of the VM and do other things. Most importantly, apply my Azure Hybrid benefit if appropriate, and make sure I get those cost savings as the machine lands here in Azure. So I'm going to go back to my vault. Now, to actually do the migration, I've created a thing referred to as a recovery plan. So recovery plan stitches together my web servers and says, I want to do these in conjunction together. You can see here, I've already run through a few test failures, but let's do this again. So I'm going to drill into that plan. You see here, I have my two source locations, the Web App 01 and Web App 02, and I'm ready to go. I'm just going to say test failure today. And it's going to make me confirm, how do you want to do this? What's the recovery point I want to use? And what network do you want to assign it to? Great. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And once I click OK, it's going to begin processing that failover. All right. So now I've kicked off the recovery, and I'm going to monitor the progress. I'm going to see that test failover is up and running in a second. And we can continue to monitor the progress here. As it processes it through, we'll see our status update here in this view. This will take a few minutes to run, and so we'll take a pause and come back and view the migration once it's all successful. Now that Azure Site Recovery has completed my migration and I see all tasks are successful, let's go check on the status of all the components we've moved into Azure at this point. So let's go look at the Azure database we moved over earlier. So here's our managed database. Here it is, Smart Hotel Registration Database, now running as a managed instance database, thanks to DMS. And my virtual machines are now both running here in Azure IaaS virtual machines, Webfront 01 and Webfront 02. Great, we're almost ready to use our application now. There's a few things I'm going to need to do to make sure that functionally works. First, I want to put a web load balancer in front of those two web app servers so I can control the traffic. So I've already set this up. I went to Corp Network. I've created a web load balancer. Great, there he is, just in Azure, a service I get to take advantage of now that I moved over. I can see here my backend pool. I've assigned those two virtual machines into that web pool, or backend pool in my web load balancer. So now when traffic comes in, it'll balance between those two. Now, we're almost ready to go try this out. I'm gonna go back to my on-prem environment to finalize my configurations. The additional piece we want to do before I test my app, I need to tell my app how to reconnect between the app servers and the new database server. So I'm going to show the desktop here and look at a couple of things I'm going to do. So first, I'm going to need to reconnect the web app server to the new database server. I've already opened that up here on my desktop. And the big thing I'm going to do here in my web.config file, I'm going to update the connection strings. And all this is taking that same database permission, or that same database string, 360 regdb. I'm going to just update my web config file. Now, I need to do that on both my servers, so you don't need to watch me type that. I've set up a script to do that, so I'm just going to kick that job off here and run with PowerShell. And what it's going to go do is move that config file over on both of those machines. We'll let that complete. And now, let's go fire this up, and let's retry our application. But now, not running on premises, I've actually moved this application into the cloud, and my application still works. Great. So sweet. There we go. Application functionality is still there, but I'm not done. There's one more thing I want to take care of and free myself of. These these servers, SQL 01 and Web 01 and 2, I can be done with those. Let's just turn them off. Let's be done. So here we go. And yes, I get to shut down my machines. So I'm fully out of my data center. So, all right, that was great. My favorite thing I get to do at the end of the day is turn those servers off post-migration. Thanks to DMS, I moved that database to a fully managed database in Azure, and I took those VMs running in VMware, and I put them over into Azure IaaS. Just like that, thanks to ASR.